For those who are visiting with us, we've been going through the book of Exodus, in also recognition of the fact that God has called us to a ministry in this season, a ministry of constructing a worship and community center. And so we're looking at the book of Exodus to see what we can learn from it, even as we walk this journey that God has so clearly called us to. Today I want to start by reading the Bible, and we'll read Exodus chapter 5 verse 9, and then we'll go to chapter 12 verse 12, and then chapter 13 verse 20 to 22. So chapter 5 verse 9 says, this is Pharaoh speaking. He says, "Make the work harder for the men so that they may keep working and pay no attention to lies." And then when we go to chapter 12, verse 12, it says, "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." And then we go to chapter 13, and we'll read from verse 20 to 22. And it reads, chapter 13, verse 20, "After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people." This has been an interesting book, and we're coming to the end of that particular series today. Some of you, of course, have found it rather burdensome in the sense that it has called us to think a lot about some of the things we hold very dear, but nevertheless, that is the word of the Lord. And so today we look at chapter 7 all the way to chapter 14, 7 verses. We looked in chapter 1, we saw and found the Israelites who had been given a promise long ago through their grandfather Abraham. They are living in a situation of social injustice, political oppression, economic exploitation, and spiritual bondage. And so God prepares a messenger, Moses. We looked at that at the second Sunday. And the third Sunday, we saw Moses going to Egypt, and telling Pharaoh to let the people go. But we saw, as we see on the fourth slide, Pharaoh, in defiance of God's instructions, tried to keep the Israelites continuously frustrated, anxious, and too busy to worship God. For those of you who are visiting and you just want to write a few notes, there are some at the back of your bulletin. But I don't know whether you have personally experienced this. When you want to worship God, you find you are getting frustrated, or there are just a lot of things that are making you anxious so that you're no longer giving the word of God time, or you're too busy. Because this is the tactic that Pharaoh used to deviate the Israelites from the call that God was giving them to be. Frustration, anxious, and busy. And if you find yourself in this, always try and look and find out, what is the evil one doing? Are you so busy that you can't even read the word of God? Are you so anxious that you can't even focus on God? Or do you get so frustrated that you just feel maybe God doesn't exist? And that is what the Israelites felt. The slave engagement became so much because they were now told to make the same amount of bricks without straw. They had to be scattered all over Egypt just to make that kind of, for them to be frustrated and anxious and so busy so that they would not focus on what they were. Pharaoh was basically, and he had this belief that he is God, and so when he was told that God wants his people to go, he could not believe it. And this is a situation that we all have to struggle with. You remember when Eve was told by the snake, she was told, if you eat this fruit, you shall be as God. You shall worship yourself. That is in the garden. So instead of worshiping the Most High, you shall worship yourself. And in that particular lie lies also the folly of man, the deification of man, the deification of myself, exalting all my achievements and protecting them with all my life. The Israelites have to be slaves for me. When you see this kind of thing, you realize what kind of people the Egyptians were. People who are self-focused and not focused on Yahweh. If you went to Egypt today, maybe you want to go to Israel or Egypt through Egypt, and you want to visit Egypt and tour Egypt. What is Egypt known for today? Pyramids, isn't it? Yeah, these people are being kept busy building pyramids, building places of death. And that is what happens when man, and when we just look at ourselves, when our main focus is ourselves and our achievements and what we can do. And I want to tell you this, even as God has called us to build this worship and community center. If our main aim is to build a place where we shall be so comfortable, where it shall be said, this person goes to Karura Community Chapel, and we have this magnificent building, and if that's your main goal for the next 3 or so or 5 years, whatever God decides, then what will happen is you'll be building a place of death. Because this whole concept is not about us. But if it becomes about us, if it becomes about Pastor Ngare, if it becomes about the elders of this church, then what we shall have at the end of a few years will be a pyramid. So we must be very careful what we are doing. It's not a place where we will exalt ourselves. The pharaohs, they had this, they loved themselves so much that they had this belief that if I just continue living even after this life, that's why they really build those pyramids really well. If I can just transfer what I have even right now into the next life. They feared the next life. There was nothing that scared them like death, because they had put in so much in this life, because that's all they lived for, that they had to put pyramids and convince themselves that I will just transfer all I have in this life into the next life. And then ensure that the next life will be better than this one. I want it to be the same standard as in Egypt or better. And that is why when they died, they would actually be buried with about 300 servants. The servants would take poison and be buried with them in those pyramids. And so it raises the question, when you die, and when I die, what will be our legacy? Will we have killed 300 people? Or shall we be going into heaven with 300 people? Because Paul calls the people we either witness to, the people we give for them to be witness to, or the people we reach as our crowns. And so you and I must always ask ourselves, do we have the Egyptian mentality? So much so that I love myself and I love this life, that I don't mind killing by what I say, by what I do, so that when I die, so many people will have died psychologically and so on. Or will I go into heaven with a train of 300 people as my crowns? For them, human life was God. My life is mine. My job is to perpetuate this luxury that I have. And if my wife gets into the way, get her out of the way. If my children get into the way, knock them out. Get them out of the way. If anything gets out of my way to enjoy this life, destroy it. And so they had this form of me, and it expressed itself in a nationalistic way. Just the same way in Kenya, our pride expresses itself in a tribalistic way, where you say it's basically about me, but you say it's about my tribe and it's about us. We are being finished, and so on and so forth. That kind of thing. But basically, it's this ultimate deification of myself and my human being. I'm in charge of myself. I need to protect myself. I need to guard myself. And so we invest so much in our gods. We spend so much on them. And then we blend, because we spend so much on our gods and on our time in them, we blend our identity and our significance with these same gods, that it becomes very difficult to move them. And this is what God is doing in Egypt. He's unmasking these gods. He's mocking them. He's toppling them from what they thought they were. And so God brings judgment on the gods of Egypt, so that all may know that He is the Lord. That is in Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. He brings judgment on the gods of Israel, of Egypt, so that all may know He's God. So what have gods got to do with Israel being in slavery? What have gods got to do with Israel suffering? And what have gods got to do with Egypt? In Exodus chapter 8, it exposes a certain subtle form of idolatry. This worship of self as the source of all that meets our needs. And this is why when Moses goes to Pharaoh, he goes with a symbol of power. This is not considered as one of the plagues, but it is between God and Pharaoh, who represents everything here. Pharaoh, his signia was a snake. It was a symbol, it was always on his forehead. And if you look at the pictures of Pharaoh, you'll always see a snake on the forehead. And this was his symbol of power. And so when Moses goes before Pharaoh, he puts his staff down and it turns into a serpent, turns into a snake. Now, many of you may remember it's Moses who wrote Genesis. The whole concept and genesis of sin was the serpent, isn't it? Satan using the serpent. And then when you go to Revelation, again, you'll find the serpent. This who is in opposition to everything that God is doing. He who approaches human being and says, did God say? He who Satan used to do all that. And so this is what is put on the ground. And what Pharaoh does, he calls sorcerers, his sorcerers and magicians and wise men. And what they do is they come and also put down their staff, and those staff turn into snakes. Very interesting. Pharaoh was saying that I have the power and the source to meet my own needs. And I meet the needs of Egyptians because I have the wise men, I have the sorcerers, I have the ability to be able to do even what Yahweh can do. But God says that all the wise men, the magic powers of the world, the sorcerers, and their ability to pull all things together, to circuit the powers of God, is nothing compared to the power of the Almighty God. And so what happens is, the stuff that Moses had put down swallowed the snakes of Pharaoh, to show him that God is more powerful than Pharaoh himself. The insignia of power is challenged for the first time. But it's interesting to note that the counterfeit of Satan, he comes, we're not told how many magicians and how many sorcerers are there, but Paul tells us later in 2 Timothy chapter 7 verse 3 to 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 7 to 8. He tells us there were two people. There was Jannes and Jambres. That, in essence, he's trying to counterfeit the triune God, because God sends two witnesses, Moses and Aaron. Pharaoh brings Jannes and Jambres, basically to counterfeit, to imitate. And this is what Satan always does. He imitates, because he wants to make us to feel that we're powerful, that we are able to do it ourselves. And so he uses these people to do magic, to do miracles. He imitates, so that they can say they have power, so that they can give this deceit that we have power. And you know, as Kenyans, we've just come from an election year, an election period, and we know what power is in this country. Not just for the people at the top, but even for the lowest person. People are willing to kill for power. They're willing to do anything for power. And this is what Satan imitates or simulates to show that he has power. But God showed him that he is powerless in the sight of God. The second thing that we see that happens, the second plague is the blood. The Nile. The Nile was a mystery to the Egyptians, because they say without the Nile there will be no Egypt. The Nile is 1,000 miles, and 300 miles are actually in Egypt. And it's just a narrow river, but it floods at certain seasons and brings crops to the Egyptians. And so they have this worship attitude towards the Nile. They had this god, a woman who they believed gave life. And this god brought the Nile at the right time, to flood at the right time, so that they can have food at the right time in the right place. Again, what happens is when Moses and Aaron make the river to turn into blood, the magicians, the sorcerers, they come and they make the river also to be, they turn water into blood. And it wasn't just the rivers, but even water in the pots and everything else. So they do the same, they imitate. But you begin to learn something about Satan. Satan is not necessarily there for your good. He's out more out to show. He's out to show power, not so much to tell you he's good. Because if he was there for the Egyptians, what should he really have done? Shouldn't he have reversed it so that the river is no longer blood? But for him, it's a power game. It's not about your good. It's so that you can know that he's powerful and so that you can worship him. And so if you and I get into this business of following God because of the miracles he will do for us, then we land into some danger. Because we'll find ourselves in a situation where we are held captive by Satan because he's able to actually do some miracles. But those miracles will never be for our good. In the long run, we'll find ourselves captive and we'll find ourselves in a situation where we are in a fix because of what he can do. He's not there to help us. And so, you see, the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile to get in drinking water. God says that you think this river is your life, he turns it into death. Their physical comfort is affected, and their God, who was called Happy, and Osiris, who are the spirit of life, the source of life, the Egyptians believed, is challenged at this stage because he cannot turn the river into water again. It is all blood. But I want you to see the grace of God. Even after he's dealt with Pharaoh, even after he's dealt with the Egyptians, he still doesn't just let the river continue being blood. He gives them another chance so that they don't continue in sin, but that they turn to him. And that, don't ever take that for granted, especially if you're not born again, or if you're living in a particular kind of sin that is in defiance to God, and begin to think that because God has not punished me long enough, or because of God's grace, then I can continue sinning. Because sooner, what happens is, as Pharaoh defied, frogs were sent to Egypt. Frogs filled the whole place. Again, the magicians simulated the same thing. Again, like I said, they should have removed the frogs. In fact, we are told the frogs were everywhere. You're cooking, and then the frog just comes and jumps into your pot. You're going to sleep, the frog jumps into the sheets before you get in. And we are told they were everywhere, in houses and everywhere. This adding frogs was not a blessing. But this is the issue about Satan. He's more about interested in power. And we are told the land stunk. Because after even Moses came and removed the frogs, they had to pile them together and there was stench everywhere. And this is also something that we need to learn. When we defy God, when we continue with sin, even after God has forgiven us, after he's let us go, it stinks. And when it stinks, it's not just for you, but it stinks for everybody. You cause a mess around the place. And so let's not take God's grace for granted. And the whole issue here about frogs, this frog god, the God who had a head of a frog, he was the fertility god, the god of sexuality. And I'm never surprised that one of the key gods, especially among young people in Kenya today, with all this social media and all these communication issues, is the sex issue. So much so that even when God says that sex has to be in a certain context, we say no. We are in charge of our own lives. We're in charge of our own sex. We will have sex when we want, where we want, and how we want it. And God is saying that there is a spirit, a God, who we have created, who is trying to take charge and be in charge of even everything that we've determined and decided. And God will deal with him. But in dealing with him, if you continue defying God, you may end up with a stench. Satan adds more frogs. My brothers and sisters, it may not always be bad things that Satan adds to your life. It may be money. You may get money the wrong way. Satan will give it to you. But there's a fellow in the Bible, he's called Zacchaeus. This fella got a lot of money through the wrong way. And eventually he got to realize that what Satan adds to you never gives you joy. And his only joy was when Jesus came into his life And when Jesus came into his life, the man said, I will give away what I took through the wrong means. Because he realized that Satan can add you more, but he can never make you happy. The next plague is nuts or lice, as we know them in Kenya. The sorcerers, when Moses throws up the stick for lice to come, the sorcerers tried to imitate this. And the sorcerers tried to do the same. And they could not. And they told Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. This is the finger of God. You see, priests, the Egyptian priests, they could never worship when they were dirty. And what happened is when the lice came to them, they became unclean. So much so that they could not worship anymore. And they began to understand what God is doing. And these lies did not just come upon men, they came upon men and women. They realized what God was doing. Gep, the God of the earth, the God of resurrection, the God of bags. You see, when a bag would go into a manure, a cow dung, it would lay its eggs into a cow dung, and the cow dung and the eggs would bring up more flies, and the dung would bring up more flies. And this fascinated the Egyptians. And so for them, this was a mystery, something that is dead but gives life. And so they decided this will be a god. So they made some gods from the bags, And they said, this is the gods we'll worship. And from those gods, they were like, this is the God who will give us life again, even after we have died. Because they are able to do that. But God challenges all that. Because the God gap was not able to stop the lies at all. Such that even his own sorcerers, his own priests could not worship. That is the nature of our God. I'm not able to go through all the plagues. But what I want you to notice is this. In the first plague, it's only Pharaoh who is affected. In the second plague, Egypt is affected, but it's just on the outside. As long as the blood is somewhere on the outside. The second plague, it's frogs. And they are everywhere. They're just disturbing everybody everywhere. But they're still external. The third one are lice. Now, those ones come on the body. And they become parasites on your body. The fourth one, which is flies, begins to affect, because these flies, if you read in Psalm chapter 78, they were not just your normal flies. It says they devoured them. These flies began to affect their possessions. And the God there is also challenged. The fifth one is livestock. Their livestock died because they had a God who was a bull, the God of the bulls. So all the bulls actually died. You begin to see now, moving from something being far, getting closer, now it's their possessions that are dying. Which means that there will be no more reproduction of animals in Egypt for a very long time because the bulls are dying in that sense. And then after that, Moses went to where they used to sacrifice humans, and a god called Hypon, and he threw that ash into the air, and they got boils all over them. And we are told that the magicians could no longer stand, and the wise men could no longer stand, because they already had boils. You can imagine in Kenya, you come and Moses would throw up that dust, and guess who would be the first people to get those boils? The doctors. And and the nurses, and all the medical people. And so you go to hospital, and you say, I have a boil, and guess who you meet? You meet a doctor, and what does he have? Infection. They're all infected. These were things that were infecting them. Their God, who was called Imahotep, the God of healing, was done with. He could not help the Egyptians at all. There was trouble everywhere. So you can see it's moving from Pharaoh, it's moving from fire, it's moving to my livestock, and now it's moving to my body because a boil is an infection in the body. And then there was a hailstorm. It's no longer just about out there. It's about death and destruction of both men and women. Nut, the God who was to protect them from heaven, who used to protect the flax, which they used to make clothes, which they used to put their mummies on. That was a God for them. He's challenged. And this God can no longer stand against the Almighty God. the God who protects them from heaven. And then after that, there's locusts. Again, you read in the details of it, you realize that these were not just your usual locusts. They destroyed everything. Nothing green was left. So Egypt was not going to have food for the next few years, so to speak. And at this particular time, Pharaoh is very worried, and he tells the Egyptians, you can go and you can worship me, but within Egypt. Moses says no. Later on again, he comes and tells Moses, okay, you can go, you can worship, but you're going to leave your children and the women. Moses says, no, we are all going. He comes and says, okay, you go, but leave the livestock. And Moses says, no. For us, we have to go and worship our God with everything. We have to worship our God with our talent. We have to worship God with our families. And we have to worship God with all that we possess. Moses is telling Pharaoh that this is the nature of our God. He owns everything that we own. And that is the nature of our worship. For the Egyptians, you could worship God with a bit of what you have and manipulate the same God with a bit of what you have. Not so with our God. And so, not the final plague, but the 9th plague, there's darkness, void. So dark, they said that you could touch it. Some of you may remember what this means in the New Testament, in Habakkuk. When Jesus was on the cross, just about to die, the whole place became so dark. And Jesus quoted Psalm 22 verse 1. He says, my Lord and my God, why have you left me? He was referring to Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 13, the first part, where it says, God is so pure he cannot look at evil. And all the evil of the world was on Jesus Christ on the cross. So much so that God had to turn his face away. And it just became dark because God was no longer able to look at that. Egypt becomes dark because God is no longer able to look at their evil. And there's just total void. They had a god, he was called Ra. Ra was the sun god, the one who gives growth, the one who gives vitality and life. Ra could not help the Egyptians. They were stuck. Because God could no longer look at the Egyptians. And this happened just before the last plague, which was death. And I will not go into those details. You see, when people worship creation instead of the Creator, everything is turned inside out. Idolatry produces disorder in all its fundamental relationships. And those who make them, this is what Psalm chapter 115 verse 8 says, those who make them will be like them, and so will those who trust in them. So why would God bring judgment on the gods of Egypt? It's so that they may know him. So that the Egyptians may know him, so that the Israelites may know him. And he says that 7 times in 3 chapters, that they may know him. Because in knowing him, it is in knowing him that everything takes its proper perspective or real meaning. Because creation is contingent on God. It cannot and will not exist without him. In whatever we ask for, we should always ask that we may know him. As God has begun us on this journey to put up for him a worship and community center, our main purpose is that we may know him. Because on this journey, God is going to challenge us. Our greatest God, as Jesus identified, is usually money. Some people say money is just notes and coins, but that's not true. Money is a sign of your sweat. Money is a sign of your ability and competence. Money is a sign of your social status. Money, according to the book of Proverbs, can do so many things. If you're sick and you have money, you'll go to the best doctors, to go to the best hospitals. Money can get you almost anything you need. And the reason for that is money can actually imitate God. And so God says, your money is mine. And I'm going to take you through a journey where I'm going to test your attitude towards money. What kind of God do you have? Is money your God or is money your servant? If money is your servant and God is God, then it serves you well. Then you'll be happy. But if it's not, Satan uses it to imitate God. And so young people will spend all their lives working so hard so that they get all the money, so that they can be God of themselves, so that no one will ever tell them what to do, so that no one will ever stand before them. And they make this God who they worship the fixation of their lives, as opposed to being a focus of their lives. And God is going to test us with those gods that we have. God is going to test us with our talents on this journey. What are you doing with your talent? Has your talent taken over your life as a God? Or is God still God? You see, when people do not know God, creation is made sacred, worshipped and treated as that which is the ultimate meaning. And God, who should be worshipped, becomes the object to be used, and creation, which is for our use and blessing, becomes the object of worship. So God becomes a stepping stone to what we want, to that God we want, as opposed to being God. And God is going to take us through a journey that is going to test everything that we have to see whether we will know Him. For if Israelites had left Egypt and gone to the promised land without knowing God, they would still have been slaves. And if we leave this place and then we move to a new worship and community center, and we don't know God, we'll be in bondage. And so the process is as important as the end. But in the process, we may know God. And once people fail to know who God is, and there's this fundamental distinction is blurred, once this reversal takes place where people worship things as opposed to worshiping God, then devastating personal, spiritual, political, and social consequences happen, as we observe in Egypt. And so in the light of this confusion, God's mission is to ultimately restore all His creation and to redeem them, that they may give glory to His name. So once creation is worshipped as opposed to God, all sorts of things happen, like the slavery in Egypt. Political, those who have political power, those who have social power, those who have military power, economic power, they begin to dehumanize others under their authority. Just like we saw, a lot of house helps in this country are dehumanized. A lot of people who work under us are dehumanized because we believe that we are God and we fail to understand that God is God of all. Worship of self eventually leads to a dangerous selfishness, just like we've seen in this country in many situations, especially when it comes to an election year. And if nature is treated as divine, then all other distinctions begins to be dissolved. There's no distinction between human life and other forms of life. And that's why you saw Egyptians were killing babies without thinking. Because there's no distinction that this is a human life, one made in the image of God and one who needs to be respected and honored. And I've seen cases here in Kenya recently, people arguing that somebody after conception, that is not a baby. That distinction goes. Another serious distinction is there is no difference between good and evil. And so everybody is for himself. And so God is on a mission to get rid of all that. There are some things, of course, that we form our gods. Are not going to that. But you know, brothers and sisters, we are living in a pagan world where I am most important. And where the things around me are most important. And we are out to worship the things of this world. And we want to believe that the things around us are what will protect us, like Pharaoh did. And we're willing even to go to magicians if necessary. We are willing to even go to church if necessary, if it will help us to achieve what we want. We want to get enough to eat. We want to get enough sleep, enough power, enough position. Which are good things, but they can become gods. And so in the last plague, which is death, before that, the Israelites had been spared of all the other plagues, but in this one, they were told you will not be spared. The only way you'll be spared is if there is a sign that death has taken place on your doors. For you too deserve death. This plague is different. Egypt is not the enemy, death is. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death. We have earned it. We deserve it. Israelites and Egypt. But there is one person who's paid for it. He became our lamb. And when we receive him, we have a mark, a spot on our lives. his blood shed for us. And so it was not an accident that Jesus died on the cross to provide a way of escape for you and me from all these gods that imprison us, from all these gods that make us imprison other people. God has made a way of escape through Jesus Christ. And I just want to pray. Maybe you're here, you don't know about this Jesus Christ. Just put up your hand, I want to pray with you. God is not here to crush us. Just put up your hand, I'll pray with you. Maybe you're here, you're feeling there are some gods who are encroaching on your life. And you want to tell God, just take these ones away from me. Otherwise, you will be so crushed with those gods, just like the Egyptians were. Why would you do that? And on the final day, you will look back and say, I knew this, but I still held on to those gods. Maybe you're here and you just want to say, I want to renounce these gods. The gods of my fathers, the gods of my tribe, the gods of everything I've held on to, and I want to make the Lord to be the center of my life.